Welcome to Concepts in American Government at Mesa Community College. This video explores the evolution of federalism in the American system. The arguments over the boundaries of federalism continue to escalate, and the debates that occurred in Congress over states' rights versus the federal system, and the questions of slavery and whether states could continue to practice it or not continued to become more and more heated. John C. Calhoun was a Southern senator who probably took states' rights to the extreme position in our country's history. And he argued for a doctrine of nullification, and that was an interpretation of the 10th Amendment, which is that the powers not allocated to the federal government belonged to the states, which meant the states were able to direct their own policies. And the Supremacy Clause, which is at odds with that 10th Amendment, says that only those laws which are made in pursuant with the Constitution have supremacy over state law. So what John Calhoun argued was that it was state legislatures who determined whether a federal law was in pursuance with the federal Constitution. And if a state legislature passed a vote declaring a federal law to be unconstitutional, then the Supremacy Clause was made null and void, and that state could ignore that portion of federal law. So that doctrine of nullification was an argument to protect states from federal encroachment. Now that doctrine was never accepted by the Supreme Court, or by any Northerner for that matter. And this debate over federalism ultimately culminated in the Civil War. And after hundreds of thousands of people were killed in this issue, the Civil War ultimately decided the issue because the North won. The United States is a singular, not a plural noun. And now when states are in conflict with the federal government usually wins. The doctrine of nullification does not exist. While the Civil War ended the notion of a doctrine of nullification and asserted the supremacy of the federal government over the states, it did not end the functioning of the states as independent entities. The dual federalism continued in the sense that the two levels of government were functionally distinct from one another. Now that is no longer the case, and so let's talk for just a few minutes on why that happened. Why did dual federalism cease to be the case? Well, there's three factors that led to the decline of dual federalism. The increased mobility of capital, the transfer of money from one state to the next, the creation of national markets and interdependence, and the emergence of large corporations. Now, if we look back at our early history and through to the mid-1800s, America was characterized by localized markets. We engaged in international trade, and there was considerable trade between the states, but the vast majority of what was bought and sold was produced locally. And this is because the cost of transportation was simply too high, and it was difficult to move heavy, bulky items, and so it was cheaper to produce those items locally, even if the local market did not have a comparative advantage in those goods. So items like clothing or glassware, the luxury items were transported, but food, basic clothing, furniture, housing, tools, things of that nature were all manufactured locally. The capital markets were also primarily locally based. Paper currency, for the most part, were not U.S. dollars printed by the Treasury, but rather were banknotes printed by the local bank. And if you wanted to engage in commerce with a neighboring state, you took your paper currency to your bank, cashed it in for hard currency, coinage of some sort, and then transferred those coins, the gold or silver, with you to the other state, deposited that money in the local bank that you were trying to trade with to receive the local currency. And then you could buy or sell or hire or do whatever you wanted. There's a lot of inefficiencies built into a market that looks like that. Now, with the advent of the railroads primarily, the economy of the United States began to dramatically change. It now became possible to easily transfer goods, even heavy goods, from one side of the country to the next over large distances. And the cost of transportation became low enough that other factors of production, such as labor or availability of raw materials, became more important in the manufacture of goods, and markets began to specialize and thereby become interdependent with one another. It became much easier to move money back and forth as these transportation nodes began to create national banks, banks that had offices in more than one state, so that you could use the same currency as you traveled from one side of the country to the next. And finally, these railroads were tremendously powerful, and not only railroads, but also other monopolies or trusts and corporations began to rise with the development of a nationalized economy. The oil industry, the coal industry, the steel industry, again the railroads, these groups began to form powerful corporations that often had more resources at their disposal than state and local governments. States struggled to maintain their regulatory ability in this new environment. If you can't control your own economy, it's difficult to continue to provide all the services and regulatory functions that the states had been used to providing. Because of the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, it made it so that a corporation could headquarter their operations out of a state with lax regulations and then act with impunity in other states, even if they were violating local laws and ordinances, because they could argue they were operating in accordance with the laws of the state where they were headquartered. Now, states began to compete for where those headquarters would be located by offering lower and lower regulations, kind of a race to the bottom. And the other states would have to allow for that business to operate. New Jersey was often referred to at this time as the traitor state because its wooing of corporate headquarters through lax regulations and low tax rates meant that companies that might have headquartered and kept their tax dollars in some states all moved to New Jersey, but maintained their operations in those other states, with those states being unable to regulate the behavior of those corporations. Now, one example would be if you look at your credit card statement, and if you look in the fine print, what you'll find is that almost all credit card companies are headquartered in Delaware. Well, the reason for that is because Delaware has very lax usury laws, and the credit cards are able to charge essentially as much interest as they want to, because that's legal in the state of Delaware. Where in the state of Arizona, for example, it's illegal to charge an interest rate above 30%. That's our state usury law. Well, if the company that's issuing you your card is not headquartered in Arizona, they don't have to abide by that rule, and they can charge you 40%. So, with this emergence of a national market, states began to lose their regulatory ability. Now, one last observation here is that these exact same dynamics are occurring in our day on the international level. With globalization, it is easy to move capital, labor, and material all over the world. That we have international markets now, and countries are becoming interdependent. And we now have multinational corporations that play countries off against one another, just as corporations played states against one another. And just as states lost their regulatory ability through the nationalization of the market in America in the 1800s, countries are now losing their regulatory ability in the international market. And it's interesting to look at the parallels and question what will happen to state sovereignty in that setting. The Great Depression was the final blow to the concept of dual federalism. This economic crisis was such a large proportion that it simply overwhelmed the ability of the states to deal with it. In addition to a lack of ability, there was a certain lack of will on the part of the states to take the measures that people felt were necessary to deal with the unemployment and the economic misery that was occurring. The state governments were controlled for the most part by rural interests. That has long been the case. And the Depression hit the cities disproportionately. And so these state legislatures controlled by rural agricultural interests were loath to increase taxes and increase public works programs for programs that would primarily help urban areas. That was not their electoral base. So whether it was lack of political will or lack of ability to deal with the sheer scope of the problem, the states were not able to provide much assistance in the New Deal. Now, President Hoover offered his sympathy for those who were unemployed, but argued that there was no constitutional provision for the federal government to fix the problem. He argued that if people wanted public works programs or soup lines or welfare programs, they ought to advocate for those things from their state governments. Now, Hoover was actually correct in his assessment. There was no constitutional basis for the federal government to provide those services. But being correct does not necessarily win elections. And Franklin D. Roosevelt promised that if he was president, he would strike a new deal with the American worker. And that new deal would fundamentally redefine federalism. He obviously won that election. But he then had the problem with the fact that Hoover was correct. It's unconstitutional for the federal government to go out and hire a bunch of people and provide welfare services to them. And so Roosevelt attempted several times to create new programs. He had difficulty getting those programs through the Congress, which was controlled by the Republican Party at the time. But even those programs that were able to get through the Congress were struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, because there really is no constitutional way to do what Roosevelt was trying to do. So he had a problem, and he tried a couple of different ways to solve that problem. One was to just have an overwhelming public support for these programs. But here we see the functioning of the checks and balances of the system that Madison had set up, because the judicial branch is immune to electoral pressure, and they just continued to rule these programs as unconstitutional in spite of how popular they were, and despite the fact that the vast majority of the country wanted them to occur. So popularity did not succeed. So he then came up with a plan to increase the size of the Supreme Court and appoint several new judges who would be open to his interpretation of the Constitution and allow these programs to go forward. But this attempt to pack the court struck many as an overreach of authority. It threatened the very independence of the judicial branch of the government. And so even his own party balked at packing the court by increasing the size of the court. So he had to figure out how to get his program through the court without changing the structure of the court. The solution that Roosevelt struck upon was called grants in aid, and it was a new type of federalism, which we now call cooperative federalism. And the way grants in aid works is the federal government says, okay, the Supreme Court won't let us hire people and provide them welfare because it's unconstitutional. What the federal government will do instead is provide that money to produce these programs and all of the guidelines for these programs and give that to the states. And the state governments would then administer those programs. So they were federally funded and federally supervised and federally regulated, but the actual administration of the programs occur at the state level. And that way, these New Deal programs would not run afoul of the Constitution. It's kind of doing an end run around the Constitution to be able to do what he was trying to do within those guidelines. Now, the programs are essentially lots and lots of federal money with lots and lots of strings attached. In fact, the strings are so rigid that it is essentially a federal program. The states simply go through the motions of hiring the people and cutting the checks, but the actual decision of how to do things is all made at the federal government. The states are merely administrators of these federal programs. And we have the pictures on the slide of the Civilian Conservation Corps and the construction of the Hoover Dam. Later we have the construction of the interstate highway system, and still to this day the maintenance of state and local roads as well as the federal highway system. All of these programs are grant-in-aids programs, and it's an example of cooperative federalism. And federalism has never been the same since this occurred. Federalism has continued to evolve since Roosevelt's New Deal. One example is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was trying to engage in his war on poverty and was running into problems with state governments who were not willing to administer the programs that he was offering, or particularly in southern states, they were administering the programs with local discrimination in the disbursement of their aid. They were not providing aid or assistance to black recipients or rural white recipients for that matter. And so what LBJ did was he began to give federal grants directly to local groups and cities, bypassing the state legislatures. Now this was still cooperative federalism, but now the state legislatures are almost completely out of the picture. This video is brought to you by Dr. Brian Dilley. I'm a political science professor at Mesa Community College, one of the 10 schools of the Maricopa District.